Hey guys, tonight we begin in a place with no ticking, no glowing screens, no tiny digital numbers accusing you of staying up too late. You are standing outside, right now, feeling the night air on your face, noticing how the sky itself seems to move even when you are perfectly still. The stars hang above you like patient witnesses, and the moon drifts slowly, unapologetically slow, as if it has nowhere else to be. This is time before clocks, raw, inconvenient, and deeply human.
You probably won't survive this, at least not if you're used to alarms, calendars, and knowing exactly how long it takes to microwave leftovers. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop a comment with your location and local time. Someone, somewhere, is wide awake while you're easing towards sleep.
Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together.
You look up again, because before clocks, the sky is your instruction manual. The sun is your bold headline, the moon your footnote, and the stars, well, the stars are the fine print no one fully agrees on. You learn quickly that time is not something you own, it's something you notice. Morning happens because light returns. Night arrives because it leaves. That's it. No snooze button, no 5 more minutes. When the sun rises, you rise, or at least you squint and complain.
One mainstream historical fact slides gently into place. For tens of thousands of years, human beings measured time almost entirely by celestial movement. The daily cycle of the sun defined the day, while the phases of the moon shaped longer rhythms, weeks, months, seasons. Long before anyone built a clock, people everywhere understood that the sky repeated itself, predictably, comfortingly, if you watched closely enough.
So you watch. You notice how the sun doesn't just rise and set, it climbs, peaks, and sinks. Midday feels different from early morning. The light sharpens, shadows shrink, heat settles in. You don't need numbers to know when it's time to hunt, rest, or complain about the heat. Your body becomes part of the measuring system. Hunger, fatigue, and boredom are all extremely accurate indicators of passing time, by the way.
Historians still argue whether early humans experienced time as something structured or something fluid, but either way, you feel it in your bones long before you name it.
At night, the sky takes over completely. Without artificial light, darkness is not gentle, it's thick. Stars explode into visibility. You notice patterns because your brain is desperate for order. A line here, a curve there. Congratulations, you've just invented constellations. Many ancient cultures used star positions to track seasonal change, especially the rising of certain stars just before dawn. This is called a heliacal rising, which sounds fancy, but really just means that star is back, so winter is probably over. Subtle, effective. Here's a quirky little tidbit to tuck under your pillow. Some researchers believe Paleolithic humans may have tracked lunar cycles by carving notches into bones. The most famous example, a piece called the Blanchard bone, has groups of markings that might represent moon phases. Or maybe it was art, or a to-do list. Historians still argue whether these markings were deliberate time records or simply decorative scratches made while someone waited for dinner. Either way, it's comforting to imagine someone 30,000 years ago also killing time. You start to realize something slightly unsettling. Time, at this stage, isn't precise. It's approximate, vibes-based. You don't say, meet me at 3:45. You say, when the sun is there, and gesture vaguely. Everyone nods. Everyone understands. Everyone is late by modern standards, but no one is rude about it. There's a strange freedom in that. Also, a lot of standing around. Seasons matter more than hours. You know when to plant because the air smells different. You know when to migrate because the animals do. Time stretches and compresses depending on what's happening. Waiting through winter feels endless. Summer vanishes in what feels like a blink.
Some modern neuroscientists would tell you that this hasn't changed at all. We just added numbers on top of the feeling. Another historical anchor drifts by. Ancient civilizations, like those in Mesopotamia and Egypt, formalized skywatching into astronomy. Priests and scholars tracked solstices and equinoxes with impressive accuracy, often using stone markers or temples aligned with sunrise on specific days. Stonehenge is the obvious example, yes, but it's not alone. Across the world, monuments quietly line up with the sky, doing one job very slowly, telling you when the year has turned. There's also debate here, because of course there is. Historians still argue whether these alignments were primarily practical, about farming and survival, or symbolic, tied to ritual and belief. Maybe it was both. Humans are excellent at multitasking, meaning onto necessity.
You, meanwhile, are just trying to figure out how long until morning. You count stars, you count breaths, you count absolutely nothing, and drift off, trusting that light will return when it's ready. There's no countdown, no urgency, just patience, and maybe a little anxiety if you're on night watch and something might be lurking in the dark. Time feels slower when you're scared. Funny how that never went away.
And here comes joke number 1, lightly padded and ready for bed. Without clocks, running late technically doesn't exist, but running into a predator absolutely does, and that really keeps you punctual in a different way. As the night deepens, you notice the moon's position shifting, almost imperceptibly. Over many nights, you learn its patterns: full, thin, gone, back again. Months emerge from repetition, not from planning. This lunar rhythm becomes so important that many early calendars are lunar, even though they don't perfectly match the solar year. That mismatch will cause headaches later, but for now, ignorance is bliss.
Another gentle joke slips in. Congratulations, you've invented months, and also the concept of being confused about what month it is. Before clocks, time is communal. Everyone shares the same sky. There's no personal schedule. You eat when others eat. You sleep when others sleep. This shared rhythm builds culture, ritual, and routine. It also means if one person messes up the timing, everyone notices. No pressure.
As you lie there, staring up, it becomes clear that measuring time began not with machines, but with attention. Careful, repeated attention. Watching the sky until it felt familiar, until change became predictable, until unpredictability felt like meaning instead of chaos. And as your eyes grow heavy, you're still watching the stars move, slowly, patiently, measuring time the oldest way there is, by noticing that you are still here and the sky is still doing what it has always done. You wake not because you decided to, but because light finds you. It seeps in first, thin and pale, then grows bolder, pressing against your closed eyelids until sleep loosens its grip. This is how days begin when time is split by light itself. There is no exact moment called morning. There is only before light, and then not before light anymore. You stretch, you yawn, and you quietly accept that the day has started, whether you feel ready or not.
Before clocks, daylight is the most obvious and universal way to measure time. One mainstream historical fact settles in gently here. Nearly all early societies divided their daily lives around the presence or absence of sunlight. Work belongs to the day. Rest belongs to the night. This sounds obvious, almost boringly so, which is exactly why it works so well for falling asleep. You don't need instructions, you just look around.
As the sun climbs, the day unfolds in loose chapters. Early light feels cool, almost forgiving. This is when movement makes sense. Walking, gathering, preparing. Midday arrives with heat and glare, and suddenly effort feels negotiable. By late afternoon, shadows lengthen again. The air shifts, and everyone becomes strangely productive, as if racing the sun itself. Evening is softer, quieter,
full of smells and routines that repeat until they become comforting. You don't say, "It's 2 p.m." You say, "The sun is high," and everyone knows exactly what you mean. Historians still argue whether early humans thought of the day as neatly divided or as a flowing whole, but it's clear that light itself acted as a natural boundary. The day begins when you can see well enough to do things. The day ends when you can't. Simple, effective, slightly terrifying if you forgot to finish something important.
There's a quirky detail that often surprises people drifting off to sleep. In many ancient cultures, the day didn't begin at sunrise. It began at sunset. The Babylonians, for example, counted a new day starting in the evening, a practice that still echoes today in some religious calendars. From their perspective, darkness wasn't the end of a day, it was the beginning. You rest first, then you act. Honestly, not the worst idea. As the sun moves, you become acutely aware that not all daylight feels equal. Summer days stretch on forever, while winter days seem to barely exist. This leads to one of the strangest and most important ideas in early timekeeping: unequal hours. Instead of dividing the day into fixed chunks, many societies divided daylight itself into equal parts. That means an hour in summer is longer than an hour in winter. You don't notice this yet, you just live with it, but it's quietly shaping how people think about time for centuries. Here's your first gentle joke of the section. Imagine trying to schedule a meeting when an hour keeps changing length. "Let's talk for 1 hour" becomes a bold act of optimism. You spend the day watching how light affects behavior. Animals move when it's bright. Birds quiet down as dusk approaches. You follow along because resisting daylight is exhausting. There's no artificial glow to trick your brain. When the sun fades, your energy fades with it. This natural alignment between light and biology is something modern sleep scientists talk about constantly, but you're living it without podcasts or blue light filters. A second historical anchor slides into place. Ancient farmers relied on daylight patterns not just daily, but seasonally. Knowing how long daylight lasted told you when to plant, when to harvest, and when to prepare for scarcity. The lengthening and shortening of days mattered more than dates. Solstices and equinoxes weren't abstract events, they were survival markers. Historians still argue whether people celebrated these changes primarily out of practical necessity or spiritual awe. Probably both. It's hard not to feel something when the sun appears to hesitate in the sky, as if deciding whether to come back. Another quirky tidbit floats by. Some ancient communities marked the passing of daylight using human activity itself. In parts of medieval Europe, a day of labor could be defined as the amount of work done between sunrise and sunset, regardless of how long that actually was. In winter, shorter days meant shorter work periods. In summer, well, good luck. This wasn't laziness, it was daylight-based logic. You work while you can see. Joke number 2 slips in quietly. Winter labor schedules were basically the original work-life balance. As the afternoon wanes, you feel time slowing. Not because it actually is, but because fatigue makes everything feel longer. Without clocks, perception becomes the clock. Boredom stretches moments. Engagement compresses them. Waiting for the sun to set when you're hungry feels endless. Watching it set while talking feels brief. Modern psychology would nod approvingly at this, but you don't need the explanation. You just feel it. The evening arrives without announcement. Light softens. Colors deepen. This is the signal, not written, not spoken, that the day is winding down. Fires are lit. Food is shared. Stories replace labor. Time is no longer about doing. It's about being. You measure the evening by events instead of minutes. One story, another story, one more, even though you're clearly falling asleep. There's debate here too, because of course there is.
Historians still argue whether evenings were primarily social or sacred in early societies. Were stories entertainment, education, ritual, or all three layered together? The answer changes depending on where you stand, geographically and culturally. But from where you are right now, it just feels calm. And then darkness fully arrives. The day, defined entirely by light, is over. Not because a number says so, but because your senses agree. You don't wonder what time it is. You know. Final gentle joke for the section. Without clocks, losing track of time is just called being alive. As you settle into the night again, it becomes clear that before hours, minutes, and seconds, time was something you shared with the sun. You rose together, you rested together, and in that simple partnership, days passed, uneven, unnumbered, and somehow perfectly complete. You stop moving for a moment, not because you're tired, but because something catches your attention. A shape on the ground that wasn't there before. Or maybe it was, but now it's longer, stretched thin, like it's trying to escape you. Your shadow. It's quiet, loyal, and surprisingly informative. Before clocks, shadows are how the day begins to fracture into smaller, more manageable pieces. One mainstream historical fact settles in here like a long afternoon. People across ancient civilizations noticed that shadows move in predictable ways. Not randomly, not whimsically. They rotate, shorten, lengthen, and always return to familiar positions. This observation is the backbone of early timekeeping. You don't need a device. You just need a stick, the sun, and the patience to notice. You plant something upright in the ground. A pole, a spear, a stick you found nearby. At first, it's just there, doing nothing impressive. But as the sun shifts, the shadow creeps. Slowly, almost mockingly slow. This creeping becomes meaningful. Midday announces itself when the shadow is shortest. Morning and afternoon stretch it in opposite directions. Without realizing it, you're dividing the day. Historians still argue whether this discovery was intentional or accidental. Did someone deliberately say, "Let's measure this"? Or did they just notice that lunch always happened when the shadow hit the same rock? Either way, the result is the same. The shadow becomes a signal everyone can see. There's a quirky, slightly delightful detail here. Early shadow timekeeping didn't require accuracy, it required consistency. As long as the sun behaved the same way most days, and it usually does, you could plan around it. Meet when the shadow reaches this mark. Stop working when it reaches that one. Precision wasn't the goal. Predictability was. Your second-person body is very aware of this predictability. You know roughly how much daylight remains just by glancing down. It's intuitive, comforting, also mildly stressful when the shadow starts racing near sunset and you realize you definitely overcommitted today. Here comes joke number 1, drifting in softly. This is the original working against the clock, except the clock is literally the sun judging you. Across ancient Egypt, shadow measurement became especially important. Tall obelisks weren't just monuments, they cast long, readable shadows. Smaller handheld shadow clocks existed too, simple L-shaped devices that told the time of day based on the sun's position. This is one of the earliest known examples of deliberately designed time measuring tools, even though calling them clocks feels a bit generous. They didn't tick, they just existed. Historians still argue whether these tools were used primarily by priests, administrators, or just very organized people who hated being early. Another strange and wonderful tidbit: shadow time didn't work the same everywhere. Latitude matters. The sun's path changes depending on where you are on the planet. A shadow in Egypt behaves differently than one in Northern Europe. This meant early shadow-based systems were deeply local. You couldn't just take your timekeeping method on vacation and expect it to work. Time, like accents, was regional. Joke number 2 arrives quietly. This is the first time someone realized time zones would be a problem. They just didn't name it yet. As you spend more days watching shadows, patterns emerge. Certain positions repeat reliably. You begin marking them: scratches in dirt, notches on stone, lines on walls. These marks become reference points, shared ones. Now time isn't just something you notice alone, it's something others can agree on. When the shadow reaches that line, a communal sentence.
This is where social coordination sneaks in. Meals, meetings, rituals, all tied to the movement of something that cannot be rushed, paused, or negotiated with. You adapt to it. Everyone does. There's a quiet equality in that. The sun doesn't care who you are. But shadows are imperfect teachers. Clouds interfere. Rain ruins everything. Night renders the system completely useless. This leads to debate even among ancient thinkers. Historians still argue whether people trusted shadow measurements deeply or treated them as rough guides, supplementing them with habit and experience. Probably the second. Humans love backups. A fringe curiosity slides in here. In some cultures, shadow length was believed to have symbolic meaning beyond time. Long shadows could be ominous. Short shadows could signal balance or favor. Timekeeping and superstition quietly held hands, just in case. Joke number 3, nice and gentle. Nothing says existential dread like looking at your shadow and thinking it means something about your soul. As the day wears on, you notice the shadow speeding up. Near sunrise and sunset, it moves faster across the ground. This uneven motion subtly teaches you that time doesn't always feel consistent, even when it is. Midday feels stable. The edges feel rushed. Modern physics would have thoughts about this, but you just feel it in your legs and shoulders. Eventually, you stop actively watching. The shadow becomes background knowledge. You know where it should be without looking. This is how time embeds itself into routine. You don't check it, you live it. As evening approaches and shadows dissolve into darkness, their usefulness ends. You accept that no single method can own time entirely. The shadow gave you structure, but not completeness. And so quietly, without ceremony, you move on, carrying the idea that time can be divided, shared, and read from the world itself. You lie back again, letting darkness take over, knowing that tomorrow the shadow will return, faithful and silent, ready to teach the day how to move. You're no longer satisfied with just noticing time. Now you want to agree on it. Watching shadows wander across the ground works fine when you're alone, but once more people are involved, work crews, rituals, meals that should happen at roughly the same moment, vagueness becomes mildly irritating. So you start adding tools. Nothing fancy, just sticks, stones, and a growing sense that time should behave itself. One mainstream historical fact settles in here with satisfying simplicity. The sundial is one of the earliest formal time-measuring devices, appearing independently in several ancient civilizations, including Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and China. It's essentially a shadow with opinions. A fixed object casts a shadow onto a marked surface, and suddenly the day is divided into recognizable segments. You place a vertical stick, called a gnomon, which sounds like a tiny garden creature, but it's just a polite term for pointy thing, and mark where its shadow falls at different times. Over days, patterns emerge. The shadow returns to familiar lines. The day becomes readable. You've turned sunlight into a schedule. Historians still argue whether the earliest sundials were designed for practicality or ceremony. Some were clearly utilitarian, scratched into stone near workplaces or temples. Others were ornate, carved, and placed in prominent public spaces. Maybe time was both a tool and a symbol. Humans love efficiency, but they also love showing off. There's something deeply calming about a sundial. It doesn't rush, it doesn't beep, it doesn't care if you're late. It simply exists, quietly translating the sky into information. You don't check it constantly. You glance at it,
the way you glance at the horizon. Time is still approximate, but now it's shared. Here comes joke number 1, strolling in like it has all day. The sundial is the original device that only works when you don't need it at night.
As sundials spread, they quietly standardize time within communities. If everyone agrees that third hour means when the shadow hits that line, coordination becomes easier. Markets open, courts convene, ceremonies begin. Time gains authority, not from accuracy, but from consensus.
Another historical anchor drifts by. Ancient Greek sundials often divided daylight into 12 equal parts, regardless of season. This reinforced the idea of unequal hours, long in summer, short in winter. The number 12 stuck, by the way, and you'll see it again later. Humans really committed to that number, possibly because it divides nicely, or possibly because once you carve 12 lines into stone, you're not eager to redo the math.
A quirky tidbit curls up here. Portable sundials existed. Travelers carried small shadow clocks, carefully calibrated for specific latitudes. Use it too far north or south, and it lies to you. Time, once again, refuses to be universal. Historians still argue how widely these portable devices were used versus how many were basically expensive paperweights for optimistic travelers. You begin to notice limitations. Sundials fail when clowns roll in. They fail indoors. They fail at night. They are loyal to the sun and nothing else. This dependency keeps time connected to nature, which feels grounding, but also deeply inconvenient when it rains for 3 days straight. Joke number 2 sneaks in. The first recorded excuse for being late was probably, "Sorry, the sky wasn't cooperating." To compensate, people refine placement and design. Dials are angled, surfaces are curved, lines are recalculated. Knowledge accumulates. Geometry quietly enters the chat. By the Roman era, sundials are common across cities, sometimes standardized to local noon. Public time becomes a thing. You can literally see it in the square.
Historians still argue whether this public timekeeping changed how people felt about punctuality. Did it increase pressure? Did it reduce flexibility? Or did most people continue living roughly as they always had, checking the sundial only when it was convenient? The truth likely depends on who you were. Farmers, officials, priests all experience time differently. Here's another strange and charming detail. Some sundials included inscriptions reminding viewers that time passes quickly, or that life is short. Even before mechanical clocks, timekeeping devices doubled as existential reminders. You came to check the hour and left contemplating mortality. Efficient.
Joke number 3. Nothing helps you relax like a stone slab telling you that you're running out of time. Despite their limits, sundials represent a shift. Time is no longer just observed, it's engineered. You're shaping how it's read, marking it, teaching others to trust those marks. This shared trust becomes social glue. Even if the measurement isn't perfect, the agreement is. As the sun sinks and shadows stretch beyond the dial's reach, the device goes silent. It has done its job. You don't resent its silence. You expect it. Time once again slips back into instinct and habit.
You walk away knowing that tomorrow the stick and stones will be waiting, ready to translate sunlight into structure. Not exact, not universal, but good enough. And in a world without clocks, good enough is kind of the whole point.
Night arrives without negotiation. One moment there's color and shape and depth, and the next, the world flattens into darkness. Your sundial is useless now. Shadows have vanished completely, folded back into the ground where you can't read them anymore. This is the great gap in early timekeeping, the long stretch where the sky offers no clear instructions. And yet, life doesn't stop just because it's dark. Before clocks, night is not measured in hours. It's measured in endurance. One mainstream historical fact settles in quietly here. Most pre-industrial societies did not divide the night into equal numbered units the way we do today. Instead, nighttime was understood in vague segments: early night, deep night, and the approach of dawn. Time during darkness was flexible, inferred from stars, routines, and human needs rather than precision.
You feel this flexibility immediately. The night feels longer than the day, even when it isn't. Without light, time stretches. Sounds travel farther. Your thoughts wander. You're either deeply asleep or acutely awake, and there's very little in between. If you're unlucky or important, you might be awake on purpose. Night watches exist long before clocks do. Guards, shepherds, sailors, and city watchmen all need to know roughly when their shift ends. So how do you tell time without light?
You look up. The stars, once comforting decorations, become functional again. Certain constellations rise and set at predictable times throughout the year. If you've memorized the sky well enough, you know when a specific cluster should be overhead. That becomes your signal. When that star reaches that position, your watch is nearly over.
Historians still argue how accurate this kind of stellar timekeeping really was. Some believe experienced watchers could estimate time within half an hour. Others think it was far looser, more about knowing when dawn was approaching than tracking exact intervals. Either way, the stars become co-workers, silent, reliable, and completely unconcerned with your comfort.
Here comes joke number 1, gently padded for nighttime use. Nothing builds character like staring at the sky at 3 a.m., trying to remember if that's the right star or just another star.
In many cultures, night is divided by events rather than measurements. The first sleep, the waking, the second sleep. Yes, another quirky historical tidbit. Historians have found evidence that many pre-modern people slept in 2 segments, with a period of quiet wakefulness in between. This segmented sleep often occurred around midnight, though nobody called it that. You wake, you think, you pray, you maybe talk quietly, and then you go back to sleep.
Historians still argue whether this was universal or just common in certain regions, but it's clear that the night wasn't always expected to be one uninterrupted block. Time during darkness had texture.
You experience this texture now. You fall asleep early because there's nothing else to do. You wake sometime later, unsure how long you've slept. The fire has dimmed. The world is silent. This middle-of-the-night moment feels timeless. It could last minutes or hours. You don't know. And strangely, you don't panic about it.
Another historical anchor drifts in. Monasteries and religious communities often developed more structured ways of dividing the night, using prayers and rituals as time markers. Bells or chants signaled moments like matins or lauds. These weren't exact times, they shifted with the seasons, but they created rhythm. Even in darkness, time could be shared. Joke number 2 slips in softly. The original alarm clock was a monk who really did not care how comfortable you were.
For ordinary people, though, night remains approximate. You know when it's late. You know when it's very late. You know when it's almost morning. These categories are fuzzy, but they're good enough. You're not trying to optimize productivity. You're trying to survive until sunrise.
Sound plays a surprising role here. In quiet darkness, you notice subtle changes. Roosters crow, wind shifts, distant animals move differently as dawn approaches. These auditory cues become clocks of their own. You trust them because you have to.
There's debate again, because there's always debate. Historians still argue whether nighttime timekeeping mattered much outside of specialized roles. Did most people care exactly when something happened at night? Or was darkness simply accepted as unstructured time, a pause in measurement? The evidence leans toward the latter. Night belonged more to rest and uncertainty than to schedules. Another fringe detail curls up here. In some ancient legal systems,
Crimes committed at night were considered more serious, not because of timing, but because darkness itself was associated with secrecy and danger. Time of day carried moral weight. Night wasn't just later, it was different. Joke number 3, whispered so as not to wake anyone. Apparently, nothing good happens after dark has been official policy for thousands of years.
As the night thins and the sky lightens almost imperceptibly, you feel relief before you see it. Dawn announces itself emotionally first. The fear of the unknown fades. The stars retreat. Birds begin rehearsing for morning. Time, once loose and slippery, starts tightening again. You don't know how many hours passed. You don't need to. You know the night is over. And that's enough. Before clocks, night is not conquered. It's endured, navigated, and trusted to end. You measure it not with devices, but with patience, memory, and the quiet agreement that light will return, eventually. As you drift back toward sleep, wrapped in that ancient understanding, the darkness feels less like an absence and more like a long, slow breath between days. Morning returns, and with it, a familiar frustration. Shadows work only when the sun cooperates. Stars disappear the moment you need them most. Night is vague, day is uneven, and clouds ruin everything. At some point, someone looks at all this beautiful sky-based timekeeping and thinks, very calmly, what if time could drip instead? You're standing near a bowl, or a jar, or a carved stone vessel with a small hole in the bottom. It's filled with water. You wait. Slowly, steadily, the water escapes, drop by drop. This is time slipping away in liquid form.
One mainstream historical fact settles in with a soft splash. Water clocks, known as clepsydra, were used in ancient civilizations, including Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, Greece, and Rome. Unlike sundials, water clocks didn't need sunlight. They worked indoors, they worked at night, they worked during cloudy weather. For the first time, timekeeping steps away from the sky and into human hands. You watch the water level fall. Marks on the inside of the vessel show progression. When the water reaches a certain line, something should happen. A speech ends, a guard's shift changes, a chord session adjourns. This is no longer about observing nature, it's about controlling duration.
Historians still argue whether water clocks were invented independently in multiple regions or spread through cultural contact. Either way, the idea is irresistible. Time as a substance you can pour, measure, and briefly contain. There's something hypnotic about it. The sound alone is enough to calm you. Drip, pause, drip. Each drop feels like a decision the universe has already made. You don't rush it. You can't. Joke number 1 floats gently by. This is the original watching time pass. And yes, it's just as exciting as it sounds.
Water clocks come in 2 main flavors. Inflow clocks fill up over time. Outflow clocks empty. Both rely on gravity doing what gravity reliably does. The problem, of course, is that water is moody. Temperature changes affect flow, holes erode, pressure changes as the level drops. Water clocks are consistent, but not perfectly so. And yet, they're revolutionary. In ancient Egypt, water clocks were used in temples to time nighttime rituals. Priests marked the hours of darkness when sundials failed completely. Some Egyptian water clocks were beautifully carved, decorated with symbols of gods and stars, blending practicality with belief. Timekeeping wasn't just technical, it was sacred.
Historians still argue whether priests trusted these clocks more than celestial observation, or used them as supplements. Likely both. Humans rarely abandon one method, they stack them. A quirky detail curls up here. Greek water clocks were sometimes used to limit speeches in court. Each speaker was given a fixed amount of water. When it ran out, so did your right to talk. No extensions, no appeals, just silence. Joke number 2 slides in smoothly. This is the first known system where running out of time was very literal and extremely awkward.
You start to notice something important. Unlike shadows, water clocks divide time into equal units. Each interval is supposed to last the same length as the last. This idea, equal time, is new. It's subtle, but powerful. It suggests that time itself is uniform, even if the day is not. Historians still argue when people truly began thinking of time as evenly flowing rather than situational. Water clocks are a strong candidate for that mental shift. Once you trust the drip, you start believing that an hour is an hour, regardless of season, mood, or weather. But belief and reality don't always line up. Water clocks require constant maintenance. Someone has to refill them, clean them, check them, adjust for temperature. This introduces a new role into society: timekeeper. Someone responsible not just for knowing time, but for tending it. In China, water clocks became increasingly complex. Some featured floating indicators, gears, and even early escapement mechanisms. These weren't just bowls, they were systems, towers, machines. Time was becoming mechanical, one drip at a time. Historians still argue whether these early mechanisms directly influenced later mechanical clocks or represent a parallel evolutionary path. The records are incomplete, and the debate is deliciously nerdy. Another fringe tidbit: some water clocks used mercury instead of water because it flows more consistently. This solved one problem and introduced several others, mainly mercury poisoning. Progress is complicated. Joke number 3, whispered gently. Turns out, liquid metal clocks were not a long-term wellness solution. As you sit with the water clock, listening, you feel time differently. It's no longer tied to light or darkness. It doesn't care if it's night. It doesn't pause for clouds. It just moves, relentlessly. This can be comforting or unsettling, depending on how much sleep you've had. You begin to trust duration. You can measure how long something takes: cooking, speaking, waiting. This changes behavior. Planning becomes more precise. Expectations sharpen. Time starts holding people accountable. And yet, it's still imperfect. Water clocks drift. They lie slowly. Everyone knows this. Nobody expects perfection. The goal isn't mastery. It's improvement. Historians still argue how widespread water clocks were outside elite or institutional settings. Were they common household tools or rare instruments reserved for temples, courts, and scholars? Evidence suggests the latter, but even limited use leaves a cultural imprint. As the last drops fall and the vessel empties, you refill it without ceremony. Time, in this form, is cyclical. It ends and then it starts again. No draw, no finality, just repetition. Before clocks with faces and hands, time flows like water, quiet, steady, and always slipping through whatever you build to hold it. You don't stop it, you listen to it. And eventually, without realizing when, you fall asleep to the sound of it passing. The water keeps dripping, but someone eventually gets tired of refilling bowls. Water spills, it freezes, it evaporates, it demands attention. And so, quietly, someone makes a small but elegant switch. Instead of liquid, they choose grains. Tiny, dry, obedient grains that fall the same way every time. Sand doesn't slosh. It doesn't leak sideways. It just falls. Softly, patiently, honestly. You turn the glass vessel over, and time begins again. One mainstream historical fact settles in gently here. Sand timers, often called hourglasses,
were widely used by the medieval period, especially in Europe, though their exact origin is still debated. They became popular on ships, in churches, and in everyday tasks because they were portable, reliable, and blissfully indifferent to weather, darkness, or latitude.
You watch the sand slip through the narrow waist of the glass. There's no sound at first, just movement, a thin stream. It's mesmerizing in the way only repetitive things can be. Your brain stops trying to predict the future and just observes the present.
Historians still argue where the hourglass was first invented. Some suggest ancient Greece or Rome experimented with sand-based timers. Others point to medieval Europe refining the design. The evidence is fuzzy, scattered, and very on brand for early timekeeping. Time devices rarely announce themselves clearly.
Not all hourglasses used sand. Some used crushed marble, powdered eggshells, or finely ground metal. The goal wasn't poetry, it was consistency. You wanted grains that flowed evenly and didn't clump. Sand from the wrong beach could ruin everything. Joke number 1 slides in softly. Congratulations, you've discovered that even sand has standards. Unlike sundials, hourglasses measure duration, not time of day. They don't care whether it's noon or midnight. They only care that a certain amount of time passes between flip and empty. This makes them perfect for tasks: cooking, speaking, guard shifts, prayer intervals. You don't ask, "What time is it?" You ask, "How long has this been happening?" This subtle shift matters. You're no longer anchoring time to the sky. You're anchoring it to action. On ships, hourglasses become essential. The rocking motion of the sea doesn't bother them. Sailors use them to mark watches, measure speed, and regulate routines. Every half hour, the glass is turned. A bell rings. Time at sea becomes rhythmic, predictable, and strangely soothing. Historians still argue whether sailors trusted hourglasses completely or cross-checked them constantly against celestial navigation. The safe answer is both. Sailors trust nothing entirely, especially time. Joke number 2 drifts in with the tide. When your entire life depends on sand behaving itself, you develop trust issues very quickly. You begin to appreciate the honesty of the hourglass. It shows you time disappearing in real time. You can see how much is left. You can feel the pressure build as the bottom fills and the top empties. This is different from water clocks, where time is hidden inside a vessel. Sand is transparent. It's time with anxiety. There's debate here too, because of course there is. Historians still argue whether hourglasses changed people's emotional relationship with time. Did seeing time physically drain increase urgency? Or did the gentle, predictable flow actually reduce stress? The answer probably depends on whether you were waiting for bread to bake or for a meeting to end. Another fringe tidbit curls up here. Hourglasses were sometimes used in religious settings to time sermons. The preacher could see exactly how much time remained. This did not always result in shorter sermons. Humans, as it turns out, are very capable of ignoring visual evidence. Joke number 3, whispered reverently. The hourglass watched them go over time and said absolutely nothing. Hourglasses aren't perfect. Humidity affects flow. Grains wear down. Tiny imperfections in the glass change timing. Each one must be calibrated, often against another method: water clocks, prayer routines, or tradition. But again, perfection isn't the goal. Consistency is. You notice something important as you flip the glass again. Time becomes reversible. When it ends, you turn it over. There's no finality, no alarm, no declaration, just repetition. This creates a sense of control that earlier methods lacked. You can restart time whenever you like. This idea quietly shapes behavior. Tasks become modular. You work for one glass. You rest for half a glass. You speak for one glass. Time becomes something you can parcel out without asking permission from the sun or stars. Historians still argue how widespread hourglasses were among ordinary people versus institutions. Evidence suggests they were common enough to appear in art, literature, and daily life metaphors. Time, for the first time, had a familiar shape. And that shape matters. The narrow waist, the widening base, the inevitability of flow. The hourglass becomes symbolic long before it becomes obsolete. It represents mortality, patience, inevitability. All very relaxing concepts right before bed. As you sit with the hourglass, watching the last grains fall, you feel a strange calm. You're not chasing time, you're accompanying it. When it finishes, you flip it again. Not because you must, but because you can.
Before clocks ticked and hands spun, time fell softly through glass, grain by grain, moment by moment, asking nothing from you except that you notice it passing. And as the sand settles and your breathing slows, you let the glass run out without flipping it this time. Some moments don't need restarting. Some are meant to end quietly.
The sand is reliable, but it isn't social. It doesn't tell you when you are, only how long you've been doing something. And eventually, that becomes a problem. Communities don't just want duration, they want coordination. You want to know when to meet, when to open the market, when the prayer bell should ring, without someone staring lovingly at a glass of falling grains. So you lift your eyes from the table and look back up. The sky, once again, gets involved.
Long before mechanical clocks, societies across the world divided the day using the movement of the sun into hours. But these hours were not equal. They were temporal hours, longer in summer, shorter in winter. Daylight was split into 12 parts, no matter the season. You wake at dawn, and the first hour stretches luxuriously in summer, then shrinks into a tight little sliver during winter. Noon still happens when the sun peaks. Evening still arrives when it sinks. The numbers stay the same. The minutes inside them do not.
Historians still argue whether people experience this as confusing or completely normal. The evidence suggests the latter. When time is seasonal, your expectations adjust. You don't expect winter days to behave like summer ones. You expect them to be stingy. This system spreads widely. Ancient Romans use it, medieval Europe keeps it, Islamic scholars refine it. Monastic communities build entire daily routines around it. You don't check the time, you listen for it. Bells ring to mark hours. Shadows slide across cloisters. Time announces itself out loud. Here's a quirky tidbit that sneaks in quietly. In many medieval towns, the bell itself was the clock. There was no central dial anyone could see. The bell rang when someone, often a church official, decided it was time. Accuracy lived in human judgment. Joke number 1 taps the bell rope gently. Congratulations, your schedule now depends on one guy's vibes. You move through your day by sound, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. These canonical hours regulate prayer, work, meals, and sleep. You don't argue with them, you adapt to them. Time becomes communal instead of personal. And because daylight hours change length, nighttime hours are often handled differently. Sometimes night is divided into watches instead of hours. Guards take turns. Monks pray at intervals that feel symbolic rather than precise. Darkness doesn't submit easily to measurement. Historians still argue whether people cared about exact timing at all. The answer seems to be only when it mattered. Markets opening, gates closing, prayers beginning. The rest of the time, soon was a perfectly acceptable unit. Another fringe tidbit drifts in. Some monasteries used calibrated candles with markings to measure nighttime hours. As the candle burned down, wax dripped past lines carved into the side. Time, once again, sacrificed itself to fire. Joke number 2 flickers softly. Nothing says bedtime like staring at a candle and hoping it burns evenly.
You notice something important in this system. Time isn't owned by individuals yet. It belongs to the community, the church, the city. You don't decide what hour it is. You're told. Bells ring whether you're ready or not. Time arrives publicly.
This shapes behavior. People synchronize not with devices, but with each other. When the bell rings, everyone hears it. Everyone responds. There's comfort in that. You're never late alone. Historians still argue whether this reduced anxiety or increased it. Did shared time create harmony or pressure? Probably both. Being late means disappointing everyone at once. And yet, there's flexibility baked in. If the sun is slow to rise, the hours stretch. If clouds roll in, judgment fills the gaps. Precision is less important than rhythm.
Another quirky detail curls up here. In some cities, different churches rang bells at slightly different times. Travelers reported confusion as overlapping sounds created competing versions of now. Time was local, even within the same town. Joke number 3 whispers from the alleyway. You are simultaneously on time, late, and early, depending on which bell you believe. You begin to sense a tension forming. Sand measures duration beautifully. Bells coordinate communities loosely. Sundials mark position when the sun cooperates. But none of these give you a universal, fixed hour that behaves the same every day.
People start wanting that. Not urgently yet, just a quiet desire for consistency. For hours that don't stretch or shrink. For time that doesn't argue with the seasons. But for now, this is enough. You live by sound, shadow, and shared agreement. You wake when others wake. You rest when bells soften. Time feels external, steady, and oddly forgiving. As evening settles, the final bell echoes through stone streets. Shops close, doors latch, candles glow. You don't know the exact minute. You don't need to.
You only know that night has arrived. The day has been portioned out fairly, and tomorrow will bring its own uneven hours, long or short, generous or brief, measured not by gears, but by light, sound, and the gentle cooperation of everyone listening together.
The bell doesn't ask if you're ready. It never has. It simply arrives, rolling through streets and fields, climbing walls, slipping through windows, settling briefly in your chest before moving on. You pause whatever you're doing, cutting bread, mending cloth, staring thoughtfully at nothing in particular, and let the sound tell you where you are in the day. This is communal time now, audible time.
A mainstream historical fact settles in comfortably here. From the early Middle Ages onward, church bells became the primary public timekeepers across much of Europe. They marked prayer hours, work periods, market openings, curfews, and celebrations. In many towns, bells were the only reliable signal that time had shifted. You don't own time, you overhear it. The bell rings for matins before dawn. It rings again as daylight strengthens. It rings when it's time to eat, when it's time to work, when it's time to stop working, at least officially. You learn to live between the sounds. Silence becomes the space where life happens. Historians still argue how precise these bell schedules were. Some records suggest remarkably consistent routines. Others hint at flexibility bordering on improvisation. The truth likely depends on who was pulling the rope and how motivated they felt that day. A quirky tidbit drifts in gently. Bell ringers sometimes adjusted timing based on weather. Heavy fog? Delay the bell. Clear skies? Ring early. Time, once again, bends to atmosphere.
Joke number 1 floats through the square. When your clock depends on vibes and visibility, punctuality becomes a personality trait. You start to realize how powerful sound is as an organizing force. Unlike sundials, bells don't require sight. Unlike sand, they don't require proximity. A single bell can synchronize hundreds of people at once. It's efficient, dramatic, and impossible to ignore.
This changes cities.
Streets develop rhythms. Bakers time their ovens to bells. Merchants open stalls when the sound tells them everyone else will too. Farmers in nearby fields listen for cues carried on the wind. Time radiates outward. Historians still argue whether bells increased productivity or simply structured it more clearly. Did people work more or just together? The answer, as usual, is frustratingly mixed.
Another fringe detail sneaks in. Some towns competed over bell loudness. Bigger bell meant more authority. Louder bell meant your version of time traveled farther. Bell casting became both an art and a flex. Joke number 2 rings out proudly. Congratulations, your town just won the Loudest Opinion About Noon award.
You notice something else. Bells don't divide time into tiny pieces. They announce moments. Before, after, now. You're either responding or you're not. There's no gentle countdown, just sound, then expectation. This creates social pressure. When the bell rings and you don't move, you're not just late, you're visible. Everyone heard it. Everyone knows. Time becomes enforceable.
Curfews are a good example. Evening bells tell you it's time to be inside. Gates close, streets empty. The sound doesn't negotiate, it declares. Historians still argue how strictly these curfews were enforced. Some sources suggest harsh penalties, others imply widespread casual ignoring. Likely, enforcement depended on mood, manpower, and whether anyone important was still outside. Another quirky tidbit slides in quietly. The word curfew comes from a French phrase meaning cover the fire. The bell told you to put out your hearth to prevent fires overnight. Timekeeping and fire safety bundled together. Joke number 3 crackles softly. Nothing says bedtime like municipal fire anxiety.
Inside religious life, bells structure devotion. Prayer happens when sound says so, not when you feel inspired. This creates discipline, routine, comfort. You don't wonder when to pray. You're told. Monastic communities refine this into something almost mathematical. Bells divide the day and night into canonical hours. Sleep is interrupted. Meals are brief. Time becomes an offering.
Historians still argue whether monks experienced this as oppressive or liberating. Did structure bring peace or exhaustion? The writings suggest both, sometimes in the same sentence. Outside monasteries, bells blur sacred and secular time. The same sound calls you to worship and to work. Time isn't split cleanly. Life is layered.
And yet, bells have limitations. Wind can carry sound unevenly. Rain muffles it. Distance distorts it. 2 bells ringing at once can create confusion. You sometimes hear a bell and don't know which one it is. Travelers write about this, moving from town to town, each with its own bell schedule, its own sense of now. Time is intensely local.
You feel this most when traveling. You arrive somewhere new and have no idea what hour it is until the bell tells you. Even then, you're guessing. You learn quickly whose bell to trust. There's comfort here, though. You're not watching minutes slip away. You're listening for permission to move on. Time feels less like pressure and more like guidance.
As evening deepens, the final bell rings. The sound stretches longer now, echoing off stone, fading slowly. You exhale with it. The day is officially done. No one checks a watch. No one counts grains. No one stares at shadows. You simply respond to the sound and let silence take over again. And as the bell's echo dissolves into night air, you realize something quietly profound. For centuries, time didn't tick. It rang. The bell fades, leaving behind a world soft with shadow and memory. You step outside, feeling the night air settle around your shoulders, carrying the faint smell of smoke from extinguished hearths and the damp scent of earth. Darkness, once a simple absence of light, becomes rich with cues. You begin noticing tiny markers, subtle rhythms, and human adaptations that quietly track time without numbers or devices. The night has its own pulse, and you are learning to feel it.
One mainstream historical fact eases into the narrative. Before mechanical clocks, people often used repeated auditory signals at night to mark intervals, particularly in cities or large communities. Watchmen called out hours, bells tolled, and drums occasionally counted time. Even in complete darkness, people could coordinate without seeing the sun. Time became sound, rhythm, and collective memory, rather than visual measurement.
You wander down a quiet street, your feet padding on cobblestones. Somewhere, a dog barks. Somewhere else, the faint drip of water echoes from a barrel. Each sound is a marker in your subconscious, helping you orient yourself. Your body keeps its own rhythm, tuned by the environment. The night is measured by experience, movement, and expectation. You are a participant in a living clock.
Historians still argue how widely these night watches were standardized. Some suggest elaborate systems with precisely timed calls, while others imply improvisation, with watchmen relying on habit and training. Either way, the purpose is clear. Humans wanted to tame the darkness, to make it predictable, and to share that predictability across communities.
A quirky tidbit drifts in. In some European towns, watchmen carried small lanterns filled with different colored oils. Each color marked a specific segment of the night. A red glow signified the first watch, green the second, blue the third. This was a primitive form of signaling, long before the convenience of modern timekeeping. You can almost imagine being half asleep, squinting at a lantern and guessing, is this the middle of the night or just slightly past it? Joke number 1 slips in softly. Nothing says, trust me, it's late, like colored lantern oil.
Inside households, simpler measures exist. Candles with markings or notches indicate approximate time. A burned section tells you how long it has passed. Cooking and household tasks are measured this way. You notice the gentle, imperfect rhythm of these methods. Unlike the rigid clock ticking later, these systems are forgiving. They allow for improvisation. They ask for attention, not precision.
Historians still argue whether candle clocks were widespread or reserved for wealthier households and institutions. Archaeological evidence suggests both. Rudimentary candles were universal, but marked, calibrated versions were rare and precious. They represent an intersection between practicality and ritual. Another fringe detail emerges. In some monasteries, monks timed the hours of sleep using sleeping mats in ritualistic nudges. Each mat was associated with a particular watch, and movement across the dormitory helped track who had rested and who had not. Sound, smell, position, all senses contributed to a tactile, embodied experience of time.
You think waking up once is annoying? Imagine being woken by a fellow monk who is also timing your sleep. Outside, you notice natural markers of night passing. The position of the moon, the sounds of owls, the subtle shifts in temperature, all guide your internal clock. Without mechanical devices, your body becomes a highly sensitive instrument, syncing with the world. This biological calibration may seem imprecise to modern sensibilities, but it is remarkably effective. You can rise, work, rest, and navigate without ever consulting a number.
Historians still argue whether humans evolved or adapted these sensory techniques primarily out of necessity or through deliberate experimentation. Probably both. You adapt because you must, and refine because curiosity rewards you. Time becomes an experience rather than an abstraction. Another quirky historical tidbit: in medieval Japan, certain cities relied on natural sounds to coordinate nightly activities. Crickets, frogs, and river currents were observed carefully, and townsfolk learned to associate specific animal patterns with segments of the night. In some ways, ecology itself became a communal clock.
Joke number 3 slides in. Nothing beats waiting for the right frog to croak if you want to know when midnight arrives. As the night deepens, you begin to notice cycles within cycles. Each segment is predictable, yet slightly different every night. The first few hours after dusk feel long and alert. Midnight feels deceptively short. Pre-dawn carries an awe and stillness, like the world is holding its breath. Without numbers, you feel time in your body. Fatigue, anticipation, hunger, and habit all combine to map the invisible hours. You measure passage by sensation, not seconds. You recall the sand, the water, the shadows, the bells. Each method transformed perception of time. The night, in contrast, is fluid. It relies on your senses, your attention, and your shared experience with others. It's less about control, more about navigation. Historians still debate the social significance of nighttime measurement. Did it enforce discipline, foster community, or simply provide comfort? The evidence implies all three. In darkness, humans seek rhythm, predictability, and shared understanding. It's a fundamental need. You, lying awake in a quiet house, feel this clearly. By the final hours before dawn, the first birds begin to stir. You hear faint wind brushing across trees, signaling a subtle shift. The world is waking, readying itself for sunlight. You prepare to return to the rituals of daytime measurement. Shadows, sand, and bells await. But for these hours, you have trusted your senses, your attention, and the communal rhythm of the night. And as darkness gradually lifts, you notice how intertwined your life is with time that isn't written down, isn't numbered, and isn't commanded. Dawn seeps softly into the sky, pink and gray, spilling light over rooftops and fields. You stretch, inhale the damp morning air, and realize the night is gone, leaving behind only traces of the hours you endured without the certainty of a clock. Your body remembers them, alertness, fatigue, anticipation, but the world is ready to hand over time once more to the familiar patterns, shadows, bells, and whatever human ingenuity has contrived. It feels like stepping back into a shared language after a long conversation in solitude. One mainstream historical fact settles quietly here. The division of the day into equal or unequal hours persisted for centuries, depending on latitude, culture, and technological development. Ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans measured daylight using sundials, while religious communities in medieval Europe used canonical hours and bells. These systems structured life, allowing work, worship, and social interaction to proceed without mechanical devices. You step outside and immediately notice the shadows returning. They stretch long across the ground, obedient yet mischievous. You trace them with your eyes, remembering the first time you observed them move. Each shadow marks a segment of the day, telling you where you are without numbers, without hands. Time is visible. It's patient. It waits for you to notice.
Historians still argue whether shadow-based timekeeping was primarily practical or ceremonial. Some evidence points to its use in agriculture and civic life, while other records suggest ritual and symbolic purposes predominated. Likely it was both, depending on context and need.
A quirky tidbit drifts in. In ancient Greece, some public sundials were decorated with inscriptions that reminded viewers of mortality, gentle warnings that time passes whether you pay attention or not. You can almost hear a modern ASMR whisper, "Hurry slowly," or "Don't hurry at all." Joke number 1 tiptoes in. Nothing like a sundial reminding you that procrastination is eternal. As you move through your morning, you notice people beginning to stir in response to communal signals. The first bell tolls, signaling early prayers or the start of labor. Smoke rises from chimneys. Market stalls begin to set up.
The day begins not with your personal choice, but with shared acknowledgement of time. You are part of a rhythm larger than yourself. Canonical hours divide the morning further. Matins and lauds fade into prime and terce, each marked by subtle bells or calls. You feel this structure rather than measuring it in minutes. It is gentle, yet firm, a social choreography that guides behavior without a visible instrument.
Historians still argue how strictly these hours were observed outside monastic or clerical contexts. Evidence suggests varying levels of compliance. Farmers, craftsmen, and merchants often adapted to the rhythms, taking liberties when practical concerns demanded flexibility. Yet the social expectation remained.
Another fringe detail emerges. In medieval Venice, tower clocks were paired with bell systems that signaled shifts in labor, ship departures, and citywide events. Even before hands or gears were accurate, the auditory signals created a sense of order. Citizens learned to read time by sound alone, a communal skill you now appreciate. Joke number 2 drifts in softly. The original ding ding, it's lunch notification system, much slower than any app, but slightly more dramatic.
You wander toward a small courtyard and notice a sundial catching the morning light. The shadow leans just so, indicating mid-morning. You recall the water clock from last night and the hourglass before that. Each method differs in approach, but shares a purpose, translating nature, matter, and sound into recognizable sequences. You realize that people layered these systems for redundancy, not obsessively, but pragmatically. When one method fails, another compensates. Historians still debate how often multiple systems were used simultaneously. Evidence suggests elite institutions, temples, courts, and cities maintained overlapping methods, while ordinary households relied on simpler approximate measures. Either way, redundancy improved reliability, and humans intuitively embraced it. A quirky detail surfaces. In some medieval towns, public water clocks accompanied sundials in civic squares. They provided both a visual and liquid measurement of the passing hours. Citizens could check either system, or both, depending on preference or visibility. Time, you realize, is simultaneously concrete and interpretive. Joke number 3 appears gently. Apparently, even in the Middle Ages, you could argue whether you were early or fashionably late, depending on which clock you trusted. By mid-morning, the world hums with coordinated activity. Bells signal the next hour. Shadows continue their silent march. You notice how human habits have adapted to these cues. Bread is baked, livestock fed, work assigned, and prayers recited, all synchronized without a mechanical heartbeat. Time has become embedded in movement, sound, and observation. Your own body participates effortlessly. You eat, stretch, walk, and pause in alignment with external cues. There's no frantic counting of minutes, no obsessing over precision. Instead, time becomes intuitive, learned through repeated experience. You recognize segments of the day because you inhabit them, not because you consult a device. Historians still debate the psychological effects of living in such a rhythm. Did reliance on natural and auditory cues encourage patience, mindfulness, and social cohesion? Or did it create subtle anxieties about unpredictability? Likely both, depending on personality and social role. By late morning, the first sunbeams climb high enough to render shadows short. You feel the subtle acceleration of the day. Midday approaches. You anticipate the next signal from bells or the sun's peak. There's comfort in predictability, even as the methods remain approximate. You pause and reflect. Time, before clocks, was multi-layered. Shadows tracked the sun. Water measured duration. Sand counted intervals. Bells coordinated communities. Stars guided nights. Each method was imperfect, yet collectively they created a coherent experience. You realize that humans have always been inventive,
adaptive and patient, responding to the natural world and social needs without mechanical precision.
As the sun climbs, you breathe slowly, sensing both the passage and presence of time. You've moved from night into day without counting a single tick, yet you are fully aligned with the rhythm of human life. And that, perhaps, is the most profound lesson. Time was never just a measurement. It was a lived, shared experience, subtly shaping behavior, thought, and society.
The sun reaches its peak, bathing the streets and fields in a warm, steady light. Shadows shrink to near invisibility, leaving only the faintest hints of their presence on stone and earth. The day feels heavy and deliberate, measured not by numbers, but by cycles: heat, hunger, activity, and fatigue. You notice how humans have quietly adapted to these natural markers, bending their lives around patterns rather than rigid schedules. It's a slower, more organic rhythm, and one that has persisted for centuries before the advent of mechanical clocks.
One mainstream historical fact settles softly here. In many ancient and medieval societies, the midday point was often marked by the sun's zenith, or by the ringing of a bell in town or monastery. It was a reliable moment for communal activities, meals, brief rests, and official business. Even without clocks, people understood and anticipated this natural apex, synchronizing their behavior accordingly.
You walk through a market now, noting how movement subtly mirrors the progression of the day. Vendors set out their goods when light is optimal. Buyers arrive when the sun is high enough to reveal colors and textures. The midday bell signals a pause, a moment to eat, rest, or adjust schedules. Time is embedded in action, not in an abstract numeric system. Historians still argue about the universality of these patterns. Some suggest that urban populations were highly attuned to communal markers like bells, while rural or nomadic communities relied on environmental cues, such as temperature, sunlight intensity, or animal behavior. Either way, humans interact with time as a flexible, contextual concept. A quirky detail drifts in. In some medieval European towns, clocks had no hands at all. Instead, their only purpose was to sound bells at intervals, letting citizens know when to begin, pause, or stop various tasks. Visual measurement was secondary. Auditory cues dominated. Time was something you heard, not something you read.
Joke number 1 glides in softly. The original check your phone for the time moment was actually just listening for a giant metal hammer striking bronze. As the day unfolds, you notice the body's own rhythms become additional markers. Hunger signals when it's time to eat. Fatigue warns when it's time to rest. Heat dictates work intensity. Humans unconsciously calibrate themselves to natural cycles, creating a private internal clock that aligns surprisingly well with public cues.
Historians still debate how much these bodily rhythms were formally acknowledged. Monastic rules codified rest and activity around canonical hours, while peasant life was more responsive to environmental conditions. Both approaches demonstrate a remarkable adaptability. Timekeeping is not only technological, but also physiological and social.
Another fringe tidbit surfaces. In some monasteries, monks used incense sticks to track time. As the stick burned down, it released specific scents and signals, marking hours or ritual transitions. Unlike bells or sundials, incense combined olfactory and temporal awareness, engaging senses in unexpected ways. You can almost imagine the calming effect, a fragrant guide to the progression of the day. Joke number 2 nudges gently. Nothing says mindfulness like sniffing your schedule. You observe the complexity of human coordination. Vendors, citizens, and clergy move in rhythm with sound, shadow, and environmental cues. You start noticing overlaps. A bell rings, and you instinctively glance at the shadows. You hear footsteps and gauge how much time has passed since the previous sound. Duration, sequence,
and communal expectation merge into an intuitive, lived understanding of time. It is layered and resilient.
Historians still argue whether reliance on multiple imperfect systems enhanced efficiency or simply created redundancy. Evidence suggests both. Redundancy ensured that life flowed smoothly despite unpredictable factors like weather, human error, or delayed observation. Imperfection, in fact, becomes a stabilizing force. Humans adapt and anticipate, forming resilient routines.
A quirky tidbit curls in. In some Italian towns, public water clocks were paired with bell towers to provide overlapping temporal guidance. The flow of water gave a continuous sense of duration, while the bell punctuated moments in the day. Citizens could watch, listen, and move with remarkable coordination, even without numerals or precise intervals. Joke number 3 floats in subtly. Imagine juggling dripping water, chiming metal, and baking bread, all while thinking, "Yep, I know exactly what time it is."
By late afternoon, shadows return gradually. The sun tilts, casting longer lines across streets and walls. You notice how quickly humans read these subtle changes to anticipate evening. Work slows, conversations shift, meals are prepared, bells echo again, reminding everyone that a day's cycle is winding down. Time remains structured, yet it is gentle, contextual, and deeply connected to lived experience rather than mechanical precision.
You reflect on the cumulative wisdom embedded in these methods. Sundials provide orientation and visual cues. Water clocks and hourglasses measure duration and intervals. Bells coordinate communities. Candles, incense, and other sensory devices supplement both day and night. Time exists as a tapestry, partially physical, partially social, partially experiential. Each thread is imperfect, but together they form coherence. Historians still argue how the human perception of time evolved during these eras. Did approximate, context-driven methods cultivate patience and resilience, or did they foster anxiety and uncertainty? Likely both. Humans seem capable of adapting to imprecision while deriving comfort from consistent patterns. As evening approaches and the first hints of sunset appear, you feel both awe and relief. Another day has passed, guided by natural and human-made markers. You are part of a living clock, responding to shadows, scents, sensations, fully attuned to the communal rhythm of time before the invention of mechanical precision. The beauty of this system lies in its flexibility. Humans didn't rely on one method alone. They layered, cross-checked, and adapted, creating a temporal ecosystem that was robust, intuitive, and surprisingly sophisticated. In the absence of exactitude, life flowed naturally, reminding you that time is not merely measured, but inhabited. The sun dips lower, painting the sky with soft oranges and muted purples, and you feel the transition of day into evening, almost as a physical shift in weight. The air cools, shadows lengthen, and the world seems to exhale. Time, once measured by the sun's climb, now slides into subtler rhythms. The mechanisms of light become less reliable, and other senses must take over. You notice how humans have always adapted, intuitively and creatively, to the dimming world around them. A mainstream historical fact settles in naturally. In medieval Europe, the evening was often marked by vespers, the canonical hour roughly coinciding with sunset. Bells rang, candles were lit, and communities began to transition from labor to leisure or reflection. Evening was a structured yet flexible time, neither entirely measured nor wholly free, where people responded to both environmental cues and communal signals. You walk along quiet lanes, listening to the distant clatter of a blacksmith closing shop, the gentle murmur of water in a nearby fountain, the faint echo of a bell calling late prayers. Each sound is a temporal marker, reminding you that time persists even when it is no longer visible. Shadows merge with the earth, yet the cues are unmistakable. Your body and senses absorb them effortlessly, like a language you've always known, but never formally learned.
Historians still argue whether these auditory and sensory cues were strictly practical or also deeply symbolic. Some evidence suggests that bells and lamps structured not only schedules, but moral and spiritual life. Vespers, for example, was both a functional evening signal and a contemplative ritual. The blending of purpose and tradition imbued time with layered meaning.
A quirky detail drifts in. In some towns, the first lights in windows signaled the end of work, the start of supper, or even the commencement of nightly curfews. Citizens could glance at their neighbors' homes to anticipate communal transitions. Lighting became a visual clock, supplementing the sound of bells. You can almost picture the subtle dance of lamp flames flickering in stone windows, communicating unspoken schedules.
Apparently, gossip was the original push notification. Look at your neighbor's lamp to know it's dinner time.
Candles, incense, and torches take on new significance during this dim period. They are more than illumination, they measure the night. Burn marks, scent trails, and intensity all serve as indicators of passing time. A candle with carved notches marks duration. Incense slowly releases fragrance. Torches are lit at intervals. You realize that humans converted fire into a shared and personal chronometer, one that engages multiple senses and requires attention, patience, and adaptation. Historians still debate how widespread these sensory timekeeping methods were. Were candles and incense reserved for wealthier households and religious institutions, or were simpler adaptations common in ordinary homes? Archaeological and textual evidence suggests a mixture. Simple candles were universal, while calibrated or scented time markers were rarer, treasured, and often symbolic. Another fringe detail emerges. Some medieval night watches relied on small rotating devices filled with sand or water that triggered chimes or minor mechanical sounds at set intervals. These early hybrid timers combined tactile, visual, and auditory cues to measure darkness, blending multiple methods to overcome the limitations of any single system. Joke number 2 drifts in softly. Nothing says innovation like being startled awake by a tiny mechanical chime at 2 a.m. And yes, it was probably your fault for oversleeping anyway.
As evening deepens, you notice the rhythm of the town adjusting naturally. Shops close, markets empty, streets quiet. Guards begin their night rounds, their calls marking intervals in the otherwise silent night. Livestock settle into pens. Families gather around fires or lamps. Time has become a shared, lived experience, measured less by instruments and more by collective activity. Historians still argue whether the layering of sensory, visual, and auditory methods enhanced communal cohesion or merely added redundancy. Likely, it achieved both. Redundant cues offered resilience. If one signal failed, another could compensate, while simultaneously reinforcing shared temporal awareness. Humans, it seems, have always understood the value of both precision and flexibility.
You start to sense subtle transitions within your own perception. The evening is longer than you expected, yet it moves steadily. Each movement of a shadow, flicker of a flame, and toll of a bell or chime signals progression. You feel a deepening awareness of your own internal clock, synchronized with your environment and community. Even without mechanical precision, you know where you are in the cycle of night.
Another quirky tidbit. In some Japanese towns, night was measured by observing natural sounds, such as the calls of insects or the flow of rivers. Citizens learned to interpret auditory patterns as temporal markers. This naturalistic approach complemented rudimentary devices, creating a rhythm tuned to both environment and human activity. Joke number 3 whispers in. Nothing like crickets and flowing water to remind you that, yes, midnight exists, whether or not you're paying attention.
You pause by a small courtyard, noting how the interplay of sound, shadow, and flame communicates layers of time simultaneously. One bell signals prayer. A candle burns down halfway. A torchlight shifts, as a guard walks past. Each cue overlaps, creating redundancy and clarity. You recognize how humans, long before mechanical clocks, orchestrated these layers to navigate the night efficiently and meaningfully.
Historians still debate the psychological impact of this layered temporal system. Did constant sensory reminders promote mindfulness, patience, and social cohesion, or induce anxiety and vigilance? The evidence suggests both, depending on social role, personality, and context. You feel both relief and attentiveness as you move through the evening, perfectly aligned with rhythms that are simultaneously external and internal.
As the sky darkens fully, you notice stars beginning to emerge, faint and patient. They mark the night differently than shadows, bells, or fire. They measure vast cycles, cosmic rhythms that dwarf your human concerns. You realize that humans have always operated at multiple scales of time: celestial, communal, personal, and sensory. Each layer informs the next, creating a temporal tapestry both complex and intuitive.
By the time you settle for rest, the night is established. Shadows, bells, stars, and flames have all communicated their part in the cycle. Time has passed, not in abstract ticks or digital displays, but through lived experience, observation, and shared understanding. You feel the depth and texture of night as fully as daylight, aware of human ingenuity and adaptation in every flicker and echo around you.
Night deepens, and the world grows quieter. You notice how the textures of time change in darkness. Shadows are long and indistinct, sounds travel farther, and even familiar streets feel mysterious. Without the sun or artificial light, humans have historically relied on intuition, attention, and layered sensory cues to navigate these hours. Time no longer arrives as a visual metric, but as rhythm, repetition, and environmental feedback. You begin to feel the night as a living organism, pulsing gently around you.
A mainstream historical fact emerges softly. Before mechanical clocks became widespread in the late Middle Ages, night was often divided into watches, particularly in urban centers and monasteries. These watches allowed for organized guard duty, prayer, and other necessary activities in darkness, relying on auditory cues such as bells, drums, and calls from watchmen. Nighttime, while lacking sunlight, was structured through human coordination and vigilance.
You walk through a quiet alley, the faint glow of a torch flickering in the distance. Each step reveals subtle markers of time: the distant call of an owl, the rhythmic dripping of water from a rooftop gutter, the shuffle of someone else moving along the street. You notice that in the absence of formal tools, humans attune themselves to these patterns, using sensory observation to synchronize with their surroundings. Time becomes experiential, not abstract.
Historians still argue how consistently these watches were implemented across different regions and social strata. Some evidence suggests highly structured systems in wealthy towns and religious institutions, while other sources indicate improvisation and local adaptation. Either way, humans used these systems to maintain social order and personal safety in the dark.
A quirky detail drifts in. In medieval towns, watchmen sometimes carried a long staff with bells attached. As they walked their route, the bell jingled at regular intervals, signaling both their presence and the passage of time. Citizens learned to interpret the rhythm. A missing chime indicated that a section of the town was unsupervised, while a steady pattern reassured the community. You can almost hear the tiny jingles marking the invisible hours. Joke number 1 drifts softly. Nothing builds trust like a bell on a stick, jangling away while the night conspires to trip you over cobblestones. Inside monasteries, night watches were even more deliberate. Monks slept in short intervals between prayers and ritual activity. Candles, lamps, and sometimes water clocks marked these periods.
sleep was segmented, measured, and observed collectively. While it may sound exhausting, it created a rhythm that integrated rest with spiritual and practical obligations. Historians still argue whether this segmented sleep was common across Europe or primarily a monastic practice. Evidence suggests that while rural and urban populations may have slept more continuously, communal and institutional environments adopted segmented patterns to harmonize the needs of safety, devotion, and social order.
Another fringe detail surfaces. In some towns, citizens used animals to mark night hours. Roosters, dogs, and even trained geese acted as auditory cues. Their calls, naturally occurring, yet interpreted within a temporal framework, helped people gauge the passing of time when bells or torches were absent. Nature itself became a chronometer. Joke number 2 whispers in. Apparently, trusting your alarm clock to a goose requires patience, but it's very eco-friendly.
You notice the subtle layering of temporal cues. Bells, torches, candles, animal calls, dripping water, and human voices overlap to create a multi-dimensional system of night-keeping. Each is imperfect alone, but together they provide redundancy and coherence. People navigate the night by listening, observing, and interpreting, rather than reading numbers or counting seconds.
Historians still debate the psychological effect of living in this sensory-rich temporal environment. Did it foster mindfulness, vigilance, and community cohesion, or did it induce anxiety and hyper-awareness? Evidence suggests a balance. Humans adapted, developing resilience while maintaining alertness in a potentially unpredictable environment.
In urban settings, night also carried economic implications. Some markets remained open for late trading, artisans continued their work by lamplight, and travelers used the sound of bells or watchmen's calls to gauge when it was safe to move. Time, while invisible, structured behavior, commerce, and interaction. You begin to appreciate that timekeeping was never only about measurement, it was about coordination, safety, and social trust.
Another quirky tidbit surfaces. In some medieval European cities, rotating light signals or fire beacons complemented auditory cues to mark night progression. Towers lit small fires at intervals, and the glow indicated which part of the night had passed. Even distant observers could read time from the lights. It's an early, low-tech form of visual communication akin to Morse code. Joke number 3 drifts in gently. Nothing says early adopter like staring at a fire tower to know it's almost midnight.
As the hours stretch on, you notice the internalization of these rhythms. Humans no longer simply follow external cues, they anticipate them. The body and mind adjust to the expected intervals of sound and light, creating a deeply embedded sense of time. You feel it yourself. Your own alertness waxes and wanes in synchrony with the night's established patterns. You sense when a watch should end, when a bell is likely to toll, when the first hint of dawn is approaching. Time has become simultaneously external and internal, lived rather than observed.
By the later watches, stars glimmer overhead, cold and steady. They mark long-term cycles, cosmic rhythms that dwarf human activity. Positions of stars help travelers navigate. Even in darkness, humans measure both hours and epochs, blending observation of the immediate world with awareness of the cosmos.
Historians still argue about the relative influence of celestial versus human-generated timekeeping in daily life. Some evidence emphasizes communal and sensory cues, while other sources highlight navigational reliance on stars. The interplay likely enriched human understanding of both short-term and long-term temporal frameworks. By the end of the night, as the last watches fade, you feel the passing of hours as a layered, textured experience: auditory, visual, tactile, olfactory, and even social. Time is measured, felt, and inhabited without a single mechanical clock. Humans have orchestrated a complex, adaptive, and resilient system of night-keeping, balancing precision, intuition, and social cohesion. It is elegant in its imperfection, reliable through redundancy, and deeply humane.
You settle quietly as the night wanes. The overlapping cues of shadows, fire, bells, animals, and human activity have carried you through the hours. You are fully aligned with the natural and communal rhythms of pre-mechanical time, aware of the ingenuity, patience, and attentiveness required to navigate a world without hands, dials, or digital displays. The night has passed, measured not by devices, but by experience, observation, and shared understanding. Dawn approaches again, though more gradually this time, as if the world is hesitating to shift from night to day.
You notice the subtle changes first in temperature, a faint chill receding, then in sound, the distant crow of a rooster, the rustle of leaves, the soft murmur of humans beginning to stir. After a night structured by shadows, bells, animals, and fires, the world seems to breathe with a calm rhythm. Time is no longer abstract.
You feel it coursing through the environment, in the cadence of life itself.
A mainstream historical fact settles gently into your awareness. In many medieval and ancient communities, dawn was both a practical and symbolic marker. It signaled the start of work, the first prayers, the opening of markets, and a renewal of daily life. Dawn was anticipated and celebrated, not just observed. People relied on natural indicators, the lightening sky, morning dew, and sounds of animals, to guide their earliest activities, long before clocks measured minutes and seconds.
You wander slowly through the streets, observing the first people beginning their routines. Bakers start preparing bread, water is carried to homes, and market stalls creak open. The same communal and environmental cues that guided night and day continue seamlessly. You realize how humans have always layered systems of measurement. The sun, sounds, shadows, and sensory signals work together to create coherence, ensuring that society functions even in the absence of precise instruments.
Historians still argue whether these natural methods of timekeeping created a more intuitive, less stressful perception of time, or if they induced subtle anxieties about unpredictability. Some evidence suggests that the human body, attuned to circadian rhythms and environmental patterns, could maintain remarkable consistency in daily schedules. Other studies hint that variability in daylight, weather, and seasonal shifts required constant adjustment and attentiveness.
A quirky detail drifts in. In some northern European towns, citizens would place bowls of water outside at night to catch frost. The melting patterns in the morning indicated temperature shifts, subtly marking time and providing information about the day ahead. Nature, in this way, became both calendar and clock. You can almost picture someone squinting at frost patterns, whispering, "Looks like the sun's a little late today."
Nothing says morning briefing like reading frozen water like an email from the universe.
As the morning grows brighter, your attention turns to the synchronization of communal life. Bells ring again to mark the first prayers and the opening of trades. Shadows return, stretching and shrinking as the sun climbs. People coordinate their activity, not by counting minutes, but by observing these environmental and social cues. Life flows naturally, intuitively, and collectively, despite, or perhaps because of, the absence of precise instruments. Historians still debate how overlapping systems, bells, sand timers, water clocks, and sundials, interacted with social norms. Some suggest these redundancies ensured that society could function even if one method failed, while others highlight the symbolic and ritualistic significance embedded in each measure of time. Likely, both practical and symbolic considerations played a role, creating a nuanced temporal landscape. Another fringe tidbit emerges. In some medieval monasteries, a small group of monks would walk silently through dormitories, striking wooden clappers at set intervals. These clappers marked half watches, waking sleepers gently for prayers without disturbing the entire community. You can almost hear the soft clack, 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 guiding attention like a living metronome.
Joke number 2 drifts in lightly. Apparently, sleep training used to involve wooden sticks instead of smartphone alarms. Hard to argue with that efficiency.
By mid-morning, you notice that the city, village, or monastery is fully awake, yet time still flows according to natural and human cues rather than mechanical precision. The sun climbs, shadows move predictably, and bells ring as a social signal. You sense the elegance of the system, layered, redundant, and flexible. Time is experienced, not merely recorded.
Historians still argue how these pre-mechanical systems influenced human perception of duration and urgency. Did reliance on fluid, variable markers cultivate patience, mindfulness, and adaptability? Or did it create subtle stress when natural cues conflicted? Evidence leans toward a blend. Humans developed resilience and social cohesion while negotiating environmental variability.
Another quirky detail. In certain Mediterranean towns, residents used water levels in fountains as a communal time indicator. The height of water in a large basin, replenished through aqueducts, reflected both the passage of hours and seasonal changes. You can imagine children and merchants alike glancing at it to gauge whether it was nearly noon or still morning. A living, shared clock.
Congratulations. You've been late to the market for centuries because you misread the fountain, and nobody cares.
As the day fully awakens, you reflect on the journey of time measurement you've experienced. Water dripping, sand falling, shadows shifting, bells ringing, candles burning, incense diffusing, animals calling, frost melting. Each method is imperfect alone, yet together they form a resilient, rich system. Humans have always found ways to live within, interpret, and synchronize with the flow of hours. The ingenuity is subtle but profound.
And now, as you begin to settle, it's time to wind down. Let yourself drift with the rhythm you've learned to perceive. Notice your breathing. Let it match the quiet pulses of the day. Remember the dripping water, the falling sand, the moving shadows. Recall the layered sounds of bells, clappers, and animals guiding the night. Feel the sun, now fully risen, bathing the world in warmth and reassurance. Time exists, always, flowing steadily, and you are in harmony with it. Slow your thoughts. Let them soften. The meticulous structures of human ingenuity fade into gentle patterns, leaving only sensation and calm. Your mind follows the rhythm of living time, natural, layered, resilient. You don't need instruments. You don't need numbers. You only need attention, awareness, and the shared human experience that has guided countless generations through day and night. Let this awareness carry you into rest.
Each moment passes, soft and inevitable, and you are part of the flow. Breathe, relax, and let the world's quiet pulse cradle you.
Now, as your eyelids grow heavy, imagine the last grains of sand settling, the final droplets of water dripping gently, and the fading echoes of night bells. Time, once so carefully measured and observed, now softens into a rhythm you can feel rather than see. Each breath, each heartbeat becomes a marker, a subtle indication of continuity and presence.
The world around you hums quietly. Shadows shift imperceptibly, leaves rustle in a soft breeze, and distant animals resume their gentle nocturnal activities. You are part of this living clock,
connected across centuries to every person who has experienced time before clocks, aware of the layers, redundancies, and human ingenuity that made rhythm in life possible. Allow this rhythm to guide you into rest, to soothe and settle, letting go of all the need to measure or count.
Let your mind drift freely, carried by the natural flow of the day and night, until sleep arrives gently, wrapping you in its quiet embrace. And as you exhale for the final time tonight, know that time is not only what has passed, but also the steady, enduring presence you feel in every heartbeat, every breath, and every moment of calm.